Okay, let's dive in. Have you ever stopped to think about the invisible scaffolding holding up our world? I'm talking about the unspoken rules, the ingrained customs, those massive organizations that shape everything, like who you are, how you talk to your neighbors. That's what we're exploring today. Social structures and institutions.
Exactly. They're these fundamental forces, often unseen, but they're like the architects of society. They shape our interactions, our
Yeah.
values, even who we think we are. And they feel so permanent, right? But they're actually always shifting, always changing.
And we've got quite the stack of sources to help us figure this out. We're looking at everything from, ancient philosophy thinking about the perfect state,
Right.
all the way to really sharp modern critiques of how society works,
Yeah.
identity, the individual versus the group, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So our mission here in this deep dive is to really unpack what these structures and institutions actually are, the formal ones, the informal ones. We'll look at key examples like family, government, maybe education, and grapple with that classic tension,
Yeah.
the individual versus society, and look at different ideas about how society is or, maybe how it should be organized.
Yeah.
We want to pull out the key insights, make some connections maybe you hadn't thought of before.
Absolutely. It feels like getting a handle on this stuff is almost like a shortcut to understanding, well, almost everything else. So let's start with the basics. The sources seem to make a big distinction right off the bat. Formal versus informal. What's the difference there?
Right. So formal structures and institutions, those are the ones you can usually point to quite easily. They have defined rules, specific roles. Often they're backed up by law. Think of them as like the official blueprints of society.
Okay, like the idea in Confucius that good government needs everyone to know their place. The prince acts like a prince, the minister like a minister.
Father like a father, son like a son. Exactly. Clear, defined rules within a formal structure. It's all about order.
Right.
And law itself is another huge example. Nietzsche has this really provocative take here. He suggests concepts like just and unjust. They aren't some universal truth we just discovered. Instead, they only really come into existence after we create laws. The law itself defines what counts as just or unjust within its own system.
Whoa, okay, so they're not like inherent moral facts,
Yeah.
but products of setting up the institution. That's quite a twist.
It really shifts your perspective on where these deep-seated ideas come from, doesn't
Yeah.
it? And Mill adds to this. He says that formal legal rules or even just really clear accepted understandings in society, tacit understandings, that's what turns certain interests into rights that deserve protection.
Got it. And the state, the government itself, that's like the ultimate formal structure, right? The entity with the power, the jurisdiction to make and enforce those laws. Mill, Taylor, Nietzsche, they all talk about this, though, from different angles.
Yes, exactly. The state is that key formal entity holding significant power. And education, too, often falls under this. Schools, universities, they have their rules, their roles, their curricula. Very structured.
Okay, that makes sense for the stuff with rule books and official titles, but then there are the informal structures. These seem maybe less obvious, but just as powerful, maybe more so.
Absolutely. Maybe more so sometimes. These are the unwritten rules,
Right.
customs, opinions, cultural norms, values, social hierarchies. They guide how we behave, but there's no law book for them. Mill points out how the likings and dislikings of society, or maybe just a powerful group within society, end up setting the rules laid down by opinion. Rules everyone else is expected to follow.
So public opinion isn't just what people happen to think. It actually acts like a force, like a regulator.
It absolutely can be a very powerful one. And Nietzsche, he goes deep into the history of where our value judgments, good and bad, even came from. He argues they didn't originate with the people who received goodness, but from the dominant groups, the noble, powerful, as he calls them. They define themselves and their actions as good, basically in contrast to the low or the common. It's rooted in what he calls the pathos of distance.
Pathos of distance. Okay, what does that mean exactly?
Think of it as the feeling of superiority, that sense of inherent difference that a dominant group feels towards those they see as beneath them. They use that feeling of distance to assert their own value, their own way of being as good, and define everything else, everything different, as inferior or bad. So it's not based on some universal moral code, but on an assertion of power and identity against another.
Wow. So the very idea of good could actually start from a place of power and dominance, not necessarily from virtue itself. That's potent.
It completely reframes how you might think about morality and values.
No.
And language. Language is another huge informal structure. Fanon argues quite powerfully that to speak a language is to take on a world, a culture. It fundamentally shapes your reality.
And he shows how this works with social hierarchies, right? Like his
Yeah.
example of the person from the Antilles trying to master French, hoping that speaking the colonizer's language perfectly will somehow make them accepted, make them white almost. It shows how language is tied into race, power.
Exactly. Those hierarchies, race, class, whatever, they're powerful informal forces, shaping who you are, what chances you get. And then there's just plain old custom, as Mill notes, just doing things the way they've always been done. That, alongside prevailing opinions, is a massive force shaping how we act without us even thinking about it.
So you've got the formal buildings of society, laws, government, schools, and then this kind of informal, almost atmospheric pressure from culture, opinion, tradition, and both are constantly working on us.
Precisely. They interact, reinforce each other. It's complex. So maybe let's turn now to some of the core institutions the sources really dig into and look at their specific functions, how they work.
Yeah, the family seems like the first stop usually, doesn't it? It's kind of where all these forces first hit us as individuals.
It's absolutely foundational. Fanon, looking at a specific context, sees the white family as an agent of a certain system. He calls it a workshop, where you get shaped and trained for life in that particular society. He even suggests that the family structure gets internalized, becomes part of our psychology, the superego, and then we project that onto how we act out in the world.
That makes a lot of sense, intuitively. You soak up norms, values, how to behave, all from your family first.
Right. And Confucius explicitly uses the family, that father-son relationship with its clear roles, as a direct model, a parallel for good government. The prince and minister should act like the father and son. It's a template for social harmony.
So the family isn't just this private little unit. It's like a mini-state, a training ground for how to be a citizen and maintain order.
Yes, exactly. But this is also where major tensions can pop up. Fanon really highlights the deep conflict in individual faces when their own family structure, their culture, feels completely disconnected from the dominant society they're trying to navigate. That example he gives of the Antillean person feeling torn, feeling they have to choose between their family, which society labels black and savage, and the white and civilized European society they want acceptance from. It's brutal.
Yeah, that really drives home how these big institutions can create incredibly painful internal splits for people caught between different worlds or expectations.
It shows the real human cost when these structures clash.
Okay, so moving to government, the state. We touched on its function for order with Confucius. Mill focuses on its job being, what, protecting interests?
Primarily, yes. Mill argues the state's legitimate power, its jurisdiction, is mainly over actions that affect other people's interests. So the state is justified in making rules, even using force or punishment, but only when someone's actions harm or infringe on the rights of others.
Okay, so Mill's view is very much about limits. The state's power stops when it comes to purely personal actions. It's about preventing harm to others.
That's his famous harm principle, yeah. But Nietzsche, he offers a totally different, much starker view. He doesn't see laws and the state primarily as protectors. He sees them as restrictions, as constraints on what he calls the fundamental will to power. This basic life drive for growth, dominance, overcoming. For him, legal conditions are actually quite exceptional. They're tools used to create bigger power units, like a strong state, by restricting smaller struggles. But a legal system that tried to eliminate all struggle, aiming for total peace and equality, he thinks that would actually be hostile to life itself, because it smothers that essential drive.
Wow, okay. That's a tough idea that trying to create perfect peace through law might actually be unnatural or even harmful in a deeper sense.
It definitely challenges our usual assumptions about law and order. Nietzsche also describes the state as this force that tames us, tames the animal man, our natural instincts. And this taming, this forcing our aggressive instincts inward because they can't be expressed outwardly anymore, that's what leads to the invention of the bad conscience.
The bad conscience. Well, what does he mean by that exactly? Is it just feeling guilty?
It's deeper than just guilt. He sees it as that aggressive energy turned back against the self. It's the root of guilt, shame, self-punishment, that whole inner world of negativity. It's a psychological state created by society, by the imposition of rules and the suppression of our natural drives.
So the state doesn't just control what we do, it can actually reshape our inner lives, make us feel bad about fundamental parts of ourselves.
It's a profound critique of civilization, really. And then you have Taylor, who builds on Tocqueville, warning about the modern state potentially becoming this vast bureaucratic state. He talks about these impersonal systems, centralized power, leading citizens to feel a real loss of political control, a sense of powerlessness.
Which sounds like it would just push people further away from feeling connected to their own society, right?
Absolutely. It feeds into that feeling of alienation from public life. So you see, just with the state, you get these wildly different takes. It's order, it's protection, it's suppression, it's an impersonal machine. It's incredibly complex.
Yeah.
And education gets a mention, too. Nietzsche criticizes the German education of his time for being too focused on abstract ideal goals and completely ignoring practical reality. He thought it actually made people less capable of dealing with real life.
Huh. So even an institution supposedly designed to prepare you for life can end up doing the opposite if it's not grounded properly.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that institutions aren't automatically beneficial. Their impact depends entirely on how they're set up and what they aim for. And thinking about their impact, it's interesting how the sources often talk about these institutions almost like they're actors, like agents.
Agents, you mean they actively do things on their own?
In a sense, yes. The family is an agent of a system, for Fanon. The state is an agent that tames, according to Nietzsche, or enforces rules, for Mill. Even specific social roles can act as agents. Nietzsche talks about the role of the priest, for example, in altering the direction of resentment.
Resentment. That's another one of those Nietzschean terms, isn't it? Sounds like resentment.
It is, but it's a specific kind. Think of it as this deep, kind of poisonous, simmering resentment and bitterness felt by those who are weak or oppressed towards those they see as strong or dominant. It comes from feeling powerless. Nietzsche argues that figures like the priest, through the institution of religion, managed to take that potentially explosive resentment and turn it inwards, or transform it. They helped create a transvaluation of values, where things associated with weakness, humility, pity, patience became good, and the things associated with strength, power, pride, health became evil. So the priestly role acts as an agent, redirecting this really powerful social and psychological force.
Ah, okay. Channeling that negative energy somewhere else, basically. That makes sense. It really highlights that these structures and roles aren't just passive boxes we fit into. They're active forces shaping us, shaping society. Which leads us right into that core tension, doesn't it? The individual trying to exist within all these powerful structures.
This is really where it gets personal for all of us, right? There's this constant push and pull between our own individual hopes, desires, and the demands that society, through these structures, places on us.
We live in an age, especially now, where there's this huge emphasis on authenticity. Be true to yourself, find your own path, self-fulfillment. Taylor talks about this, defining your own originality.
Yes, and it holds enormous moral appeal today. But Taylor adds a really crucial caveat. He argues that true authenticity, being true to yourself, isn't something you can achieve just by looking inward in isolation. He says it actually requires us to consider our ties to other people, and it involves demands that come from something. Well, something bigger than just our own individual desires. Trying to achieve self-fulfillment without that connection to others, he suggests, can actually be self-defeating.
So you can't just find your true self locked away somewhere. It's fundamentally linked to other people.
Absolutely. Taylor really emphasizes that our identity is dialogical. It's formed through dialogue, through interaction, through needing recognition, or sometimes suffering from misrecognition from others. Fanon's work is a perfect, if painful, example of this, how racism, how society, seeing the black man through stereotypes, profoundly shapes his sense of self. So society doesn't just limit you from the outside. It gets inside and helps shape who you believe you are, often based on how it sees you.
Right, right. You see yourself partly through how others see you. And Mill points out a danger he saw even back then, not that people had too much individuality, but that they had a worrying lack of it. He was concerned about people living under this kind of constant censorship, always shaping what they want and do based on custom, based on what others expect, rather than listening to their own nature.
He puts it so vividly, the mind itself is bowed to the yoke of conformity. And the result, withered capacities. People just don't develop strong personal inclinations or characters. Fanon echoes this too when he talks about how those feelings of inferiority experienced by the black man aren't just psychological quirks. They're actively produced by the social and economic realities that systematically make people inferior in that society's eyes.
So the pressure to fit in can be so intense it actually shapes our innermost feelings, our desires.
Yeah, that's a sobering thought. How much are my desires really mine, and how much are they just echoes of what's expected? It's a core question these thinkers force us to ask. But they don't just leave us there. They also talk about resistance, about how to navigate these pressures. Mill argues that sometimes just the example of non-conformity, someone simply refusing to bend to custom, is itself a hugely valuable service. Especially, he says, in an age where the tyranny of opinion makes eccentricity a reproach.
So just being different, standing out, can be a form of resistance against that crushing conformity.
It can be. He thought it was vital to actually encourage exceptional individuals to act differently from the mass. Their originality, their different ways of living and thinking, act as a necessary counterpoise to the dominant power of collective mediocrity. They show other possibilities exist.
And Nietzsche has this idea of the free spirit, right? The
Yeah.
independent thinker who might need to withdraw somehow, find their own space away from the noise and conformity. He talks about finding one's own desert.
Yeah, it's a powerful metaphor. It's about creating that internal space, and maybe some external space too, away from the pressures of the herd mentality. A space to cultivate your own values, your own perspective, outside the dominant norms. It's another survival strategy for the individual against the tide.
Let's shift just slightly. There's also this distinction made sometimes between community and the broader society. Do the sources touch on tensions there?
Yes, Taylor talks quite a bit about fragmentation. That's the phenomenon where people increasingly lose their identification with their wider political community. That sense of belonging just sort of atrophies. And he links this often to that feeling of powerlessness we mentioned earlier, the kind you get from facing large impersonal state structures.
So as society gets bigger, maybe more bureaucratic, those closer local community ties or even the feeling of belonging to the nation can weaken.
That's the worry, yes, the connection to the larger society phrase. But Taylor also holds out some hope. He talks about a potential virtuous circle
Mm.
where successful common action people actually getting together and achieving something collectively can create a sense of empowerment. And that feeling of empowerment can then strengthen people's identification with their political community, pushing back against that fragmentation.
So action and agency are directly linked to rebuilding that sense of belonging. Interesting.
And Mill, of course, constantly brings us back to that fundamental conflict, the rights of the individual versus the claims of society to exercise authority over them. He uses the historical fight for religious liberty as a really clear example of where that battle line has been drawn and fought over.
That constant negotiation of the boundary between my freedom and the group's control.
Exactly. It's central.
Which brings us to the really big question then. Based on all this, how should society be organized? It sounds like there's no single easy answer coming from these sources.
Definitely not. You have Confucius offering that model based on clear hierarchical roles. Stability and order come from everyone knowing their place and performing their duties correctly, mirroring the well-ordered family.
Then you have Mill championing individual liberty above almost all else. His core principle is limited government. Society, the state, should only step in when your actions harm someone else. Otherwise, leave people alone.
Right, maximizing that sphere of personal freedom as long as you don't cross the line into harming others. Nietzsche, characteristically, is more critical than prescriptive. He's suspicious of any system that tries to stamp out all struggle, seeing that as potentially anti-life. He looks at legal systems more pragmatically as tools for building bigger power structures, not necessarily as guarantors of justice or rights in some abstract sense.
So he's less interested in an ideal structure and more in how power actually flows and shapes things through whatever structure exists.
That captures it well, I think. And Taylor points towards democratic empowerment, giving citizens real political control, real participation, as a way to fight that fragmentation and powerlessness caused by huge bureaucracies. It's a way to reconnect people to the political community.
And Plato, though mentioned in our background, his focus in the Republic on an ideal state with philosophers ruling in distinct classes, it feels maybe more like a philosophical blueprint for justice itself, perhaps less engaged with the messy, practical tensions of individual freedom versus social pressures that the other thinkers really dive into.
It offers a vision of perfect order, certainly, but perhaps less about navigating the conflicts we experience in less than perfect societies.
Okay. So if we try to weave all these threads together, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive?
I think the biggest one is just how incredibly powerful these social structures and institutions are, both the formal ones we see and the informal ones we often don't. They really are the architecture of our lives. They set the norms, shape our values, and are deeply, deeply tangled up with our identities.
And running right through it all is that constant tension, that negotiation between us as individuals wanting authenticity, freedom, our own path, and the pressures, the expectations, the sheer weight of society and its institutions.
Exactly. And thinkers for centuries have been wrestling with this. How does society actually work? How should it work? And how do we strike that incredibly difficult balance between needing order and community and needing individual liberty and self-expression?
It's a dance, isn't it? A really complex, ongoing dance between the one and the many.
It really is. And perhaps here's a final thought to leave you with, something to really chew on after this. Considering just how profoundly these social structures, these opinions, cultural norms, even how others see us, how deeply they influence what we desire, what we value, maybe even who we think we are. How much of what you believe to be your own unique individuality, how much of that is truly, genuinely originating from within you, and how much might actually be a reflection and internalization of the very structures you live inside and the expectations they've subtly imprinted on you.
Yeah, that's a question that definitely makes you look at yourself and the world a little differently.